And we are live.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's researcher salon, we'll be speaking with Trent Van Epps, EF researcher, about software enclosure and software commons and in Ethereum and Linux. There's a link to the SOP forum in the Zoom chat and the YouTube chat where we'll host any conversation about the salon, in addition to the readings of the week and other protocol musings. Our next town hall will be a guest talk on April 3rd with Jay Graber. You can find Summer Protocols research, the program calendar, along with more info about the protocol kit at summerprotocols.com. And I'll hand it off to Tim to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Ever. Yeah, Trent and I work together at the Ethereum Foundation on a bunch of stuff, but probably the most notable project Trent has been stewarding over the past couple of years is Protocol Guild. And the idea there is to create a collective of the different contributors to Ethereum and allow them to self-curate the list of who is actually contributing so that the community can fund and support this work. And that's led them through a lot of thinking on how does capital impact common and public goods, not only like not only their exploitation, but also their entire production pipeline. And Trent, you had this really good article that you turned into a talk, or vice versa. I forget the order, that you're here to walk through. So yeah, I think this will be a unique perspective on just the sort of capital structures that are kind of unique to blockchain and Ethereum, but then how they relate to more general public goods and commons. So yeah, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim, for the intro, and Timber, Josh, Venkat for inviting me to present here. As Tim said, I'm going to be presenting capital and enclosure in software commons, specifically with case studies on Linux and Ethereum. I'm a member of Protocol Guild, Stateful Works, and the EF. This talk will be about 40 minutes, so there'll be time for questions. At the end, I'll just jump right into it. So obviously, disclaimer, claims are my own. They don't represent the individuals at the Protocol Guild, the Ethereum Foundation. And the context, as Tim mentioned, I've been working on Protocol Guild since 2021. This is a collective of Ethereum core contributors and also doing work creating cultural artifacts with Stateful Works since 2020. And both of these projects and my engagement in the core Ethereum protocol space has really informed a lot of this stuff here. As he also mentioned, this was previously a presentation. I started working on this in May of last year and presented it at Protocol Berg in Berlin, and then refined the diagrams and the paper itself, and then released that in January of this year. And now I was excited to actually be able to spend time and go back over the last few days and tighten some things up. So again, thanks for the opportunity to present. But these are the people who were involved in sort of tuning the initial paper in January. So I really appreciate all of these individuals who spent time giving me feedback on it. A big jumping off point for me was this book called Incorporating the Digital Commons. Sorry. No, I fucked it up. There we go. I'm just going to hide my face. Okay. Incorporating the Digital Commons by Benjamin Birkenbein. The subtitle is Corporate Involvement in Free and Open Source Software. And this really was a jumping off point for me when I read it last year. It gets into Linux and some of the ways in which this commons has evolved over time, specifically Capital's relationship to it. So definitely recommend people check that out if they're curious. How is this relevant to Summer protocols? Yes, software protocols are technical resources, but they are socially and politically reproduced over time. They don't exist in a vacuum. And so looking into the underlying frameworks which actually produce these protocols or software objects is really important to understanding how they situate themselves within a broader context. So hopefully that's convincing. This is the outline. I'm going to first introduce the idea of commons and enclosure, and then we'll get into the case studies and then a conclusion at the end, and I'll talk a little bit about protocol guild. The big claim is profit-seeking entities have the greatest incentive and capacity to co-opt software commons and the processes that maintain them over time. And the two prompts that I hope you'll think about as I'm presenting, and we'll come back to them at the end, is first, is co-option unavoidable for mature, complex commons? And relatedly, how can protocol stewards adapt to this if it's unavoidable? And two, do embedded capital circuits and network-bound state help or hurt the stability of the Ethereum Commons? And if these don't make sense now, hopefully the next slides will shed some light on what this actually means. And I'd be curious your thought on both of these, as well as the original claim. So let's start with modes of production. We're going to zoom out quite a bit and look at this first at a high level. Today we live in a world of capital. This is the way things are produced. You work a job, you create a resource, you're paid a salary, and typically somebody else in this provisioning of this resource benefits. This is a capitalist system. Because I work in Ethereum, which I'm arguing is a commons, we're going to compare these two things as sort of a dichotomy, common versus capital. These are modes of resource production that have their own internal logics. And the internal logics, common asks, how can the benefits or assurances, surplus value generated or bound up in this resource, how can it be distributed to the largest public? And capital asks, how can these benefits accumulate to private entities? So you have this productive entity at the center, that sort of blob object, and it has a choice. If we're to give it agency, it has a choice whether the benefits of the resource it produce accrue to broad publics, is it available to many people, or do the benefits accrue to a subset of the people involved in producing this resource? So this is the backdrop that I'm operating within and comparing these commons resources to. The resource that these productive entities produces can be arranged on a 2x2. I know that as part of summer protocols, everyone is required to pay the 2x2 tax. So this is for Venkat. Hopefully this is good enough. This is your 2x2 tax for this presentation. But this is a very common framing to understand resources and how they're produced, and they're typically arranged on these two axes, rivalry versus excludability. And sometimes rivalry is called subtractability, but generally it means what's the competition to consume the output or a particular resource. So a private good like an apple, if I eat it, you can no longer eat it. It's been subtracted from existence. The good no longer exists, and that would make it a private good, a rivalrous private good. This is also called subtractability because it reduces the supply of the object. Then on the other side, you have excludability. It's how can I prevent someone, or to what degree can I prevent somebody else from using this good? So if you're using a shared good like your city metro, and I'm sitting in a chair, I can't exclude you from using it, but it is rivalrous, right? We both can't sit in the chair, the seat on the metro at the same time. So this framework is used to evaluate a lot of goods and economics and like political economy studies. This is the academic framing. You've probably heard the term public goods if you've been in Ethereum for a bit, and these are things like they can't be subtracted. Like we can all benefit from weather forecasts and understanding what the weather is tomorrow, and I can't exclude you from understanding what the weather is, right? So this is this sort of framework to understand resources and their provisioning and specific characteristics they have. And typically, commons would fall into this shared goods bucket. This is just the name. Sometimes it's called common goods, sometimes it's called shared goods, but like a natural common, like a fishery or a forest, these are rivalrous because we both can't consume the same natural resource. But I can't, if you're engaged in producing this shared good, I can't prevent you from using it. So this is sort of the framework we're operating within. And recently, some academics have started to think about, okay, how are there things that exist outside of this this 2x2 dichotomy and have started to think about this concept of anti-rivalry. And this is goods, especially in the context of digital objects or software. These are goods that they don't necessarily have the same characteristics that traditionally affect natural or physical objects. Software objects are non-physical, so they don't have the same contention. And in fact, there are network effects, is sometimes a term used to describe this, of if you and I are on the same network graph, we both benefit from our use of this particular product. We benefit when there are more people building products for it. We benefit when our neighbors use it. And this is where blockchains fall into. There's a network effect. Permissionlessness means you can't exclude other people from using it. And we actually both benefit from as many people using it as possible. And so the term that sort of academic study has settled on is symbiotic goods. I'm sure if you went somewhere else, you'd find another name for it, but symbiotic goods is good enough for our purposes today. And so we're gonna look into open source software in the context of Linux and open source blockchains in the context of Ethereum and how they're symbiotic goods and maybe some differentiation between the two. So coming back to this idea of common, you have a local instantiation of the commons logic, which is, you have a local instantiation of the common logic, which is a commons, right? It's the same as a company is a local version of the capital motive logic, or it's this, just a local representation. So we're going to go through this sort of framework that I've put together that describes how these things operate and how they produce a resource. It's pretty basic. You start with peers, set of individual actors come together. They want to build something of mutual interest. They share the responsibility of shaping the system, and they bring their unique perspectives, experiences, tools, whatever things are necessary to inform their labor. So they bring these, and they're situated in time space in a particular way according to constraints. And these constraints are pre-existing. These are the thinner lines on the diagram. For like a farmer's collective, they have pre-existing constraints that they don't control, like the weather of a particular geography. That informs when to harvest, when to plant, things like that. For a non-physical good, software good, you will have licenses attached to existing software. And then there are constraints that are self-imposed or opt-in. So the social, political, economic relationships amongst the individuals that are actually doing the work, decision-making frameworks, norms that people agree to abide by in order to produce this shared resource. Generally, these can be under frameworks of production. So you have peers and their labor placing themselves voluntarily within these constraints, and in doing so, they produce this common resource. And the metaphor here is it's a common resource because the area is the same size as the set of individuals that are producing, right? You see the outline of this blob shape directly maps to the set of individuals and the constraints that they place them in. And this represents not just the resource, but the surplus value bound up within this system of producing a resource. So the surplus value, the assurances, the benefits that are contained within it are available for all the people to use. And they have particular guarantees by engaging with it. For example, if somebody were to engage in a fishery commons, they have, I am licensed to extract X amount of fish from this fishery at this time. And that's the right and the constraints define the rights and obligations available and expected to the peers that are actually contributing to it. But what does it look like when this is, compromised in a way? Academia calls this enclosure. Birkenbein, the author I mentioned, calls it incorporation. Ethereum would call it capture or a coordination failure. And this is when you have some influences which come in and constrict the possibility space. You still have the same set of actors potentially that are engaged in producing this resource, But instead of the surplus value or the benefits being distributed to the broader set or all people engaged in its production, it's now, it's been collapsed down to the 6 people at the center. Whether this is like a former commons that was enclosed in some way or co-opted, or this could be like, just a normal company, right? This is a pretty typical setup if you think about it in the alternate frame. And to illustrate this, I'll just do a quick little foray into the past about the historic enclosure of English pastures. So, for many thousands of years, not just in England, but around the world, there was this idea of commons, this shared land that anybody could use, and it was maintained according to sets of social agreements. They provided resources to support livestock, and in turn, it produced manure to fertilize the fields of the farmers. So, right, and it's maintained through social agreements between the local community members who actually live there. However, in England, over a couple hundred years, this changed over time when you would have sort of the royal appointment of a new baron. And this individual would erect walls, combine plots of lands in a way that was more efficient for growing crops, but it alienated the individuals from what was previously a commonly held asset. They were prevented from utilizing the land according to ancient customary rights, and it's been superseded by a new framework with the baron at the center, right? So you have this imbalance in terms of who has access to the ultimate benefits of this resource production. And the new dynamic is bootstrapped under a regime of physical violence, normalized over time by social, political, religious justification. This took hundreds of years in England, but radically changed the landscape of resource production, and it paved the way for capitalism as we know it today. Now, of course, Ethereum isn't a farm in the English countryside. It's a digital object that can sidestep some of these the pressures that are unique to physical objects. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about the social and political pressures or encroachments that are still very much present. So that's what we'll get into next. But just a quick break before we dive into it, a little poem from around that time. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose. Some anon who was mad about losing his land, and rightfully so. So let's get into it. These case studies about Linux. So hopefully you're familiar with it, but if you're not, it's an operating system, and specifically what we're going to start with is the kernel, which is like the core component of this operating system. It's open source, freely available. Started in 1991 by then student Linus Torvalds, and got enough adoption over the course of 10 years that it led to Microsoft's Steve Ballmer calling it a cancer. So there's big controversy at the time. And today the project has grown to become what many consider the largest collaborative development project. Somebody can fact check me on that at the end. And we'll get into like this expanded commons, but a lot of these logos underneath the Linux logo are distros. They're these projects that take this core kernel object and expand it in an opinionated way. And it's uniquely enabled by the commons framing that Linux is stewarded within. So let's use that same framework from before to structure the Linux commons. So we start with developers as we did previously. Today, the vast majority of these individuals are employed by corporate entities, people that create products around the Linux ecosystem. Contributors with no company affiliation as of December 2022 were only about 3% of the total contributors. And you'll have like large companies like Huawei or Oracle who are actually engaged in the production of this resource. And again, similarly to the previous examples, the work of these individuals is structured within constraints. It guides the work of the developers over time. A big one is open source software norms. If you have feedback, you give a detailed pull request. If you find something that breaks, you give a bug report in order to it's this mutual aid collaborative environment where you want other people to, if you're using the product, it benefits you to help them improve it. So a lot of open source etiquette drives some of the culture within the Linux community. There's also social dynamics, or you can also even think of it as a political dynamic, given it has dictator in the title, but the BDFL is benevolent dictator for life. It's a term given to Linus sort of to recognize the deference that a lot of people pay to this individual. He's been around since the beginning. He was the originator and has a lot of local knowledge, know-how, and just experience dealing with this common mode of producing a open source resource of this scale. So a lot of people defer to him. He's very much involved in the project today, and they give him this term, the BDFL. The code is licensed under the GPL v2, so the general public license is the way for software to interface with the legal system. And this is really important. It was revolutionary at the time. People were struggling with how to monetize or how to actually frame these software objects in a way that made sense. And the GPL license is one of the open source licenses and one that came around during that time. And it was pretty revolutionary and contributed significantly to the explosion of Linux being used by many multinationals, international corporate entities today. And so the work of these individuals employed largely at corporate entities filtered through these norms, these constraints, produces the kernel resource. Today it's, as a resource, going back to that framework we looked at before, low excludability, the kernel source code is available for anyone to use, and it's anti-rival as a digital object, or low subtractability. One person reading or running this software does not restrict my ability to do the same. And everybody benefits from there being more Linux users and more people understanding this digital object. Yeah, I think that's all I had for this. I just wanted to emphasize, this is a really big project. It's 30 million lines of code, just to underscore the scale of this. It's big. And so what people have done with this is they've expanded the Linux Commons because of the license. Generally, the constraints enable this expansion. You have the license, you have open source software norms, you have the extensibility of the Linux kernel software, and what you start to see is mini versions of Linux pop up that take an opinionated look at what the kernel could be and how to modify it in a particular way. So these are called distros. Again, they might share some of the same constraints, some of the same norms. They might share some developers where you'll see the overlap in the diagram between the distro 2 and the core commons. And these opinionated interpretations of the Linux kernel source code produce the first versions of user-facing state or user-bound state. People that are actually using the software in a way that is unique. So I can run this locally in my computer. I can have an operating system that's tied to me. But what's missing here, and we'll get into in Ethereum, is there's no monetization. People can come and use it, but capital isn't embedded anywhere in this system to this point. Again, so everybody shares the kernel resource, and this is where you start to see the symbiotic nature of this object. If everybody is tied into the kernel resource in the same way, there's some shared assumptions about how it's managed, how the code can be expected to change over time, and these give some characteristics of stability to the core commons if you have many different entities and independent projects engaged in the same way. They sort of stabilize each other. And this is really underscores the commons maintenance of the Linux kernel. Anybody can show up and contribute back to it if you're working on a distro. Anybody can fork the source code. Things like this are important to maintaining the commons nature. However, it's not all rainbows. And what happens is the commons guarantees will get exploited by capital objects or capital entities coming in from the outside. So there's no capital circuits that are baked into the Linux Commons, which is, Still trying to figure out whether that's good or bad. It's just a trade-off, it seems. But what you do see is capital entities come from outside. So big caveat here, not all companies are evil. The people that work at companies aren't evil, but it's worth thinking about the incentives of capital as it comes into a commons, especially something as unique as Linux, as unique as Ethereum. These are symbiotic software artifacts that can only work if there's a broad buy-in of legitimacy from the companies that are engaged in its maintenance, things like this. And so what you'll see is corporate entities come in, and what they want to capture is that user-bound state. They want to take that and turn it into a product, whether it's hosting the distro project as a legal entity, or they'll actually take the product and sell it or change it in a particular way, provide service or support guarantees. So again, in addition to the caveat I just mentioned, like there's a reason this happens. Is because large corporate entities, they want guarantees. If they're going to use this software, they want guarantees of, if I have an issue, I want somebody to go to and help me fix it. So it makes sense why there's like commercial actors engaged in commons production, because there isn't a way for them to, at least in this context, like starting from the 90s up until now, these corporate entities are not comfortable without having this this sort of guarantee that the software that they're using is going to have some support services. So that's sort of the unique context to Linux. But what you'll start to see, in addition to the creating, like productionizing or creating products out of this user-bound state, the software that distros are producing for free, is you will see capital entities start to engage in the social and political constraints that structure labor. And that's what we'll get into in the next slide. This is a case study and a case study of Red Hat. Red Hat is, if you're familiar with Linux, it's one of the larger companies that operate in that space. And I'll say this is like a very abridged version of their story, but you can at least see the arc. So founded in 1993, relatively close to the start of Linux. So they've been around a long time, have had early days, a lot of goodwill in the community, so much so that in 1999, they tried to gift IPO stock to Linux contributors. And this is pretty crazy to imagine. This is uniquely enabled by like the open source nature of the Linux Commons, that anybody can show up. And so they their heart's in the right place, and they thought, we'll try to include these Linux contributors in the financial upside. Effectively, the surplus value that would have otherwise that's bound up within the Linux Commons is being realized in this IPO, and we're going to give some of that back. So kudos to them in 1999. This was an incredible idea, and some parallels to Protocol Guild that we can get into later, but it didn't last very long, right? In 2014, 20 years later, 15 years later, Red Hat partnered, quote unquote, with CentOS, which is another distro project situated within the broader commons of Linux. Basically, the short version of the story is CentOS was using a version of a Red Hat product that they maintained, but they were using a sort of an altered version of it, and they weren't managing the project very well, according to Red Hat. And so they stepped into, they didn't like how it looked or how it was reflecting back on them, that the project was run poorly. So they stepped in to partner, quote unquote, with CentOS, the community, and effectively took over control of it. I think they got some board seats out of it for the CentOS Foundation, or the nonprofit entity that's attached to it, and exchange, like, they get influence and they'll give funding to CentOS. So we're starting to see this relationship with the commons change as success comes about and capital enters the commons stewardship regime. A couple years later, in 2019, Red Hat was acquired by IBM for $34 billion. Again, this is like viewed as the poster child, the success story of how a company can be profitable while engaging in something as crazy and wacky as an open source ecosystem. but it continues to go downhill. This project that they partnered with, CentOS, Red Hat decides to deprecate it, much to the alarm of the people that were using it. They had provided these guarantees of, oh, we're committed to open source software, we're committed to CentOS, and supporting this long term, and then a couple years later deprecated it, not long after they were acquired by IBM. And the final anecdote we have here, they went even a step further last year and they restricted access to the source code for one of their projects, which is a huge faux pas for this space. It's the nature of the Commons production is contingent on these norms being observed, right? Source code should be available. People should be able to engage with the products. You can make profit from using that in other places, but what you're starting to see, hopefully, over this arc is a change, a resituation of the relationship as capital starts to get introduced. Now, this is one company. It doesn't map to every single company who engages in Linux, but hopefully it's illustrative of how things can go in these contexts. So the second case study, Ethereum. Hopefully you know what that is. 2013 announced by former journalist Vitalik Buterin, went live in 2015 under the audacious tagline of World Computer. I still love this term. In 2018, during the previous bear market, 2 bear markets ago, venture capitalist Fred Wilson suggested in very strong terms that Ethereum should be more like a company. I think his words were, Ethereum's fucking blowing it, or something like that. So he was pretty frustrated with core devs at the time. And today it's the world's largest blockchain network. And so you'll see the parallels to Linux here. There's this core component, the Ethereum L1, and the body of stewards that produce the software has enabled this explosion of layer 2s and different projects that leverage the security or settlement guarantees of the core protocol. So there's this similar explosion of projects that can reinterpret and make opinionated adjustments to the core protocol. So we'll do the same thing for the Ethereum Commons. You have people show up, developers, researchers, facilitators, with a shared goal of producing software related to the EVM. And a lot of these are, yes, employed by for-profit companies, but there's still a healthy balance that are employed by nonprofits, or they're for-profit ostensibly, but their main motivation is just working on the core protocol, right? They don't have monetized products in the same way that you'll see in Linux. So these individuals show up and, again, place themselves within the constraints. A lot of these are shared with Linux, so open source software, a lot of open source licenses. These are both shared between Ethereum and Linux. And then there's additional venues or structures that help coordinate modification or stewardship of the protocol. These include the all core devs call, the EIP process, specifications. These are all sort of bound up, or I would say they're under the umbrella of constraints that help to structure the production of software in the Ethereum Commons. And then there's also shared values, censorship resistance, autonomy, self-determination, permissionlessness. All of these things are constraints. And maybe in contrast to Linux, there's no BDFL. Vitalik is, well respected in the space, but he's stepped back from core protocol research and development. And there's a really, I would say there's a robust set of people and individuals and projects that now engage with stewarding the protocol over the long term. And so all of this labor and effort is structured in time space by these constraints and produces the resource, the Ethereum Software Commons. It's a body of software artifacts which can come to consensus on the output of EVM operations, and these are run in a globally distributed environment. So this includes research, so it's a snapshot of the Ethereum protocol today and in the future. Has a whole bunch of different client teams that create different implementations of the protocol in different languages. I think there's probably 12 today. So this has grown over time. The difference between the Ethereum Commons and Linux is that it has this quirk. what I mentioned at the beginning, it has this embedded capital circuit. And what does that mean? Hosted within this software commons, there's this capital object, and that's, the Ethereum L1 is inherently constructed according to capital circuits, right? Proof of stake, ETH the asset, block space, the block space supply chain, liquid staking tokens, MEV, restaking. All of these things are bound up as capital circuits within the L1. And because the software, when it's run, produces this capital object, they're effectively, I mean, here, there's like a distinct boundary. I didn't know how else to illustrate it, but there's this object is bound up within this software process, and there's this reflexive relationship between the broader software commons, and the object that it produces, this digital software object. So you have a capital circuit contained within. So the question is this sort of a containment where you can reduce the worst externalities of capital because you define the rule sets it operates within? Or is this, a contradiction just waiting to fail? Because at the end of the day, Ethereum, the Commons, sits within a broader field, an all-encompassing, all-consuming capital that defines how resources are produced in the world today. So this is an interesting contradiction / containment, depending on the perspective you take. I'm cautiously optimistic, but who knows? We really might be only able to see the long-term effects of this and the capabilities over many years. So that's the first prompt. The Ethereum L1 is usable as an object right out of the box, but it has this capital entity engaged, embedded within it, and I think that's an interesting difference. And because this is engaged, like I said, does this help the protocol or harm it? Because you're going to have capital wanting to get out or get in, and along the way, it might disrupt the software commons within it, or the software commons that is sort of in the way to get to these processes of stewardship. One other note here is that the Ethereum L1 is a single global artifact, right? You're running software on your computer locally, but that software is, it's a distributed system which talks to many other computers around the world, and they come to consensus on a single object. Whereas with Linux, you have, I'm running Linux OS on my computer, and basically that's, it's a local object, it's a user-bound state. But with Ethereum and blockchains, you have, as a distributed system, you have globally bound state. So we have these two interesting differences from Linux, where you have embedded capital circuits and you have a global object. And the question is, do these things help or hurt the stability of the Ethereum Commons? Do they just make the anti-rival nature more attractive for capital incentives? It's definitely attractive for people that engage with the Ethereum Commons. So you have consumers and producers of EVM block space that show up and attach themselves to this core Ethereum Commons and are able to produce opinionated interpretations of both the software and their differentiated relationships with the block space. So again, they'll share sometimes the individuals who are actually writing the code. Sometimes they'll work on the core protocol layer, but also the L2. Sometimes the norms and values also, for the large part, I would say they transfer between the core community and the broader commons. Some of them are structured more as commercial entities, but what they can't avoid as L2s, ignoring that little L1 in the top left, they can't avoid they're bound together within this state object. As a distributed system, they want to inherit the security guarantees of the security and settlement guarantees of the L1, and in doing so, they cede some of their optionality or agency by locking themselves into a particular relationship with the L1, and in doing so, all of a sudden we have this digital object which is scaled across communities and domains. So you'll have maybe an application or an L2, and it's encumbered, it's bound up within the broader commons. Whereas in Linux, you have like little software objects now all of a sudden we have this massive digital object that's being reproduced and scaled up. And again, the question is like, what does capital think of all this? Is this just even more of an attractive object, and are we doomed to kind of be co-opted even earlier than Linux was? So again, this is sort of what the network-bound state object looks like as the broader commons starts to expand. And that brings us finally to Ethereum Enclosure or Capture. Capital's going to show up. It already has on the edges and within, right? Ethereum has this challenge from day one: is how do you develop a system that can run on economic incentives, or projects that depend on economic incentives, while also maintaining the underlying commons approach. So you'll have capital entities show up, and because they can't, in a sense, they can't chop off each of these state objects, like the little spur that's coming out from the side. They can't sever the settlement or security guarantees. Otherwise, you lose all the benefits of being a layer 2. So a capital object can't come in and, sorry, a capital entity can't come in and just sort of take off this L2 and say, oh, here's this profit generating entity, I'm just going to leave with it. There are constraints that come along with engaging with Ethereum as an L2. So, this is at least a bright point. But as an alternative, does that mean that they instead engage with the constraints and frameworks of production at the lower level, the social and political processes, these like dashed lines that you see in the diagram? Do they instead engage at that layer? Do they try to peel off contributors to come work on their project, and in turn take their they gain access to their local knowledge, their local relationships, maintaining the core commons, or even this L2? It remains to be seen like how this will actually play out, but the concern is, because it's this anti-rival object, it's going to be a huge concern moving forward, and we should really think about the second order effects as we move forward. Of course, the caveat, well, I'll go back really quick. The caveat, I want to make sure to mention, like, core devs, if you're listening, I love you all. Just because you work for a company doesn't make you evil. There are many companies engaged in Ethereum that share the same values. Just because it's a profit-seeking entity doesn't mean that you're going to automatically seek to co-op and destroy the commons. That's not what I'm saying, but it's worth considering. So as I'm wrapping up here, the last 2 slides, the first question is like, where has capital shown up in the Ethereum Commons? Again, as I mentioned, there's these embedded circuits. Another example, a few years ago, a layer 2 team purchased a client team that was engaged in protocol maintenance. And then sort of the unknown, where core contributors leave, or the unknown of like they never joined core protocol work because of the incentives elsewhere. Capital entity coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to pay you a ton of money to come and work on this other thing and not engage in common stewardship. And the challenges of this is that capital biases towards speed, not necessarily long-term sustainability. And sometimes it can crowd out other intrinsic motivations. I think there's hope. Obviously, it's early days for Ethereum, and I think there's a strong set of values and norms that actually look promising for the future. But the question is like, okay, will we be able to maintain? Will we be able to avoid co-option from capital coming in from the outside, or capital trying to get out from the inside consistently? So there's some examples here. Like over time, we've done. I say we, speaking as Ethereum. Obviously, I'm not Ethereum and I don't run the protocol, but there have been issuance decreases, which lower the amount of funds that go to validators. The contributor set has grown without compromising on values. I think that's a huge win. Other things like in the protocol that counteract these capital influences. There's a withdrawal delay for validators, which slows the velocity of capital, which is a good thing. It enhances the capabilities of, or the guarantees that the network can offer to people who are using the network. And then there's like broader things like the EVM, public private keys. These are all shared, so it reduces lock-in in case some L2 decides to go rogue and try to, not necessarily be a positive sum actor. So I'm hopeful. And then I'm bringing it back full circle to like that original claim. These prompts, is co-option unavoidable? Do capital circuits and network bound state help or hurt the stability of the Ethereum Commons over time? Like, what do the next 10 years look like? And to that's the sub point of the second question. Protocol Guild, as I'm wrapping up here, as I mentioned, it's a collective of contributors, and we ran a pilot which distributed 14 million to 167 members, and we're working on a V2 of this. This makes unaffiliated stewardship possible, where you don't necessarily have to be embedded in a corporate entity or somebody that's going to make you compromise. In a worst case scenario where they're trying to get you to, explicitly pursue their interests. This is something that I came across when I was looking into Red Hat and projects like that. The employees themselves, they don't have agency. They're like, I just work here. I don't think it's a great decision, but I'm just an employee. So this gives people agency as a backup of last resort, where they have this unconditional funding that they're able to access, regardless of, the only condition is that you're contributing to the core protocol. So it has this benefit, and the hope is that this will grow and stabilize and diversify both the contributor set and the commons. And yes, I am very much aware of the irony of giving a talk on capital and then ending with a claim that more capital in the right context will help to solve some solve some of these conflicts. But yes, that's the claim I'm making. So thank you for listening. Thank you again to the Summer Protocols people for engaging with this. It's been a thrill to see the program take shape over time. And thank you again for your time and listening. Hopefully there's some questions people can poke holes and stuff, or let me know what wasn't clear. Thank you.
Yeah, Dorian has his hand up, so let's maybe kick it off with him.
Yeah, thanks for that, Trent. It's very interesting to see this sort of arc. I guess what I'm trying to sort of imagine consider the parallels of Linux here and Red Hat in particular, and just over the years, like Red Hat was always kind of like a bit like smarmy anyway, almost like it was like it kind of had the veneer of like you use Red Hat kind of thing. But if I'm not mistaken, like Red Hat EL is like just the package manager and the support contract, right? Like all of the other stuff that is, and of course, like obviously if they're like RPM packages of stuff, like it's almost like because again, there's all these other Linux distros that have that are still going, they're still chugging along, and so like one company took its kind of did its rug pull and took its little corner of the thing private. But like, and sure, like, CentOS, is no longer, and the people who were using that for some reason are inconvenienced. I guess the thing that I'm wondering is like almost looks like that is the extent of the damage that can be done in that regard. And I'm just kind of wondering, like given that Ethereum like is money, and I was sort of thinking about the embedding in the sort of the ocean of capital that you diagram that you had for the one. Is like, so could somebody just come along, with $200 billion and like buy like 50% plus one Ethereum and then just say like, we're running this now? Like, is that is that the kind of failure mode or attack vector that you're thinking? Like have you been wargaming out like specific incursions to that effect, or yeah, like I don't know. I just I'm more interested in like in the specific like those kinds of attacks, I guess to call it.
Yeah. So for your point about Red Hat, you know, them making one of their software products private is not the end of the world, of course. What it is indicative of how these co-options happen. It's subtle and it's over time. And what it influences is not like, hey, we're gonna purchase half of the Linux ecosystem and take it private. It's not possible. There are some constraints that just prevent these things from happening. But what it does do, it influences the stability of the broader commons. When you have not just Red Hat, but you have dozens of companies reproducing this behavior across the entire ecosystem, that's where the issue comes up. And the same thing for Ethereum. You wouldn't have somebody show up and try to purchase half of the supply, right? This would completely undermine the guarantees of the claims that this network is making to its users and the people that are building on it. And it would probably actually hurt your investment if you tried to purchase half the supply. But what will happen is the more subtle underlying like death by a thousand cuts things, where you have these corporate entities show up and they want to engage in a certain way, and the resource form that they have is capital, and they're going to put it to work engaging in the stewardship process, whether it's a social or political, enacting their interests. But yeah, I don't think it would be something as over the top as you mentioned.
Yeah, I guess I mean like I can see like what you did say about like drawing off people to do like their to work on something else is a good example of just the kind of nibbling that a corporate entity can do. But like to what extent could you make a company like if I was a company that I wanted to develop stuff on the Ethereum stack, like to what extent can I make a thing that only benefits my company and nobody else? Like, or at least that I am the principal beneficiary, and me and my company is the principal beneficiary. So other people benefit, but I benefit the most. Like, what does that look like?
I guess it depends how you define benefit. Like, because you're by default enforcing the network effects of this symbiotic good by just using the network. So you can't capture all of that benefit. You can make a contract that sends 100% of the fees to yourself for sure, but there are some limits into how much you could profit in that sense.
I'm reminded of there's a great paper by Nordhaus called Schumpeterian Profits and the Alchemist Fallacy, where he posits that an organization, like if they invent something, that they may be able to get like 5% of the total value, while the other 95% goes to everybody else, although that 5% is like the single biggest chunk, which is kind of an interesting benchmark. And then of course you can aggressively I would anyway. Yeah, but thanks. I also like the anti-rival concept. That was very interesting to think on.
Thanks. Yeah, not my concept.
Take credit for it.
I did not invent that.
We have 3 minutes left, so Venkat, can do you.
Yeah, your last comment in closing kind of struck me, the irony of starting with like sort of like an anti-capital sort of like tack, and then ending on capital is the answer. And I think one of the reasons we run into this kind of irony is we have these huge overloaded suitcase concept words that don't really mean anything because they mean too many things to too many people. I think capital in the sense economists use it, capital in the sense communists use it, and capital in the sense that it exists in a contract for the protocol guild are actually very different things with very different sort of like, I don't know, laws of econophysics driving them. So can you kind of like, we don't have to invent terms right now, maybe this can be a project, but can you kind of like comment on like the flavors of quote unquote capital that are in the picture here? Like it doesn't seem to me like capital embedded in the commons, even if it's in financial form, should be considered commons. It feels more like, shared pasture, for example, which is considered a commons, right? So can you comment?
Yes, 100%. As I was going through this and like tweaking things, I did realize this myself. So like, if you and I have a credit system where I give you an hour of my time as a token, and you also give, like, this is a shared local system, it could probably have a price ascribed to it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Is that like, big C capital, or is that just a method of bookkeeping that we use between each other? And so the same way, like you said, very much so, like all of this isn't just, the red maw of capital coming to consume commons, well-meaning commons contributors. It's situated in a particular context. And I think if I were to take this further, I would think about in what ways, like literally the embedded capital circuit of proof of stake, of ETH, like these are within the domain of core contributors, right? They have, and not just core contributors, but the broader community sort of owns this asset, or the process for changing the characteristics and the nature of the asset. Whereas capital is like, the big C capital is out of anyone's control. We don't control the incentives. But yeah, I guess that's the question I was trying to touch on, is like, because it's contained within this commons stewardship process, does that fundamentally change the nature of it? To what degree does that happen? And then in the same way, Protocol Guild, it's not just money flooding through a mechanism. There's particular guarantees about, like, I'm a member and I know that this other person is doing the same work. They're not going to seek funding outside of this necessarily, but the funding coming through this mechanism is only enabled by us banding together in solidarity. So in a sense, it's almost like a local money that serves a particular purpose. The context is definitely important. And if I could give a huge caveat, I'm way out of my depth on like the political economy stuff. So to anybody listening to this later on or reading it and saying, wow, that guy has no idea what he's talking about, it's probably true. But I'm very curious to keep learning about this stuff, because I think there's something there analyzing the relationship between these capital circuits and how they're embedded in the commons. But you're totally right. Like they have different characteristics.
I know we're just out of time, but a quick comment for people listening in the same conversation. I think we should include conversations like, women's labor in the domestic sphere, and what is beginning to be called shadow labor, like bagging your own groceries at the grocery store. I often think that they have the same irony problem where you're tempted to like put like a legible monetary label on it and say, hey, women's labor in the household, especially historically, should be like given a GDP value, blah, blah, blah. Same thing with shadow labor. Diane Coyle, who's an economist who studies open source, she argues that a lot of free software should be added to GDP, right? So there's like all these things, I think, actually stretch and break the capital concept. And the trick may not be to like, make these legible to the lens of capital, but kind of make capital itself illegible and suck it into the sphere of long tail weirdness, because I'm starting to think there's no such thing as capital. It's all kind of like this diverse mess of, I don't know, value flow. But sorry.
Yeah. No, for sure. I don't have anything to add there. If I hopefully I have some more thoughts on this in the future, but yeah, that would be one thing I would explore, is like refining this idea and the relationships between these objects. Yeah. Tim, did you have any thoughts? I mean, this is pretty relevant. I know you gave feedback on the paper, but
I don't want us to go for half an hour over. Yeah, I have plenty, but I think, we've covered it all already.
We have a couple of questions, one from YouTube and one from Jenna. So maybe if you can stay a couple of minutes longer, Trent could answer that.
Yeah, of course.
So here's one from YouTube. I'm wondering about stuff like Wikipedia and user-generated content on on-chain social networks like Farcaster. Where do they fall in the excludability rivalry matrix?
Wikipedia is this is another actually in earlier drafts, I use this as an example of like a digital commons, not necessarily software, but it's really available for people to use and access, and it has like this open structure for engaging in the maintenance of the resource, which is the Wikipedia corpus of text. So yeah, I would say that would be probably also falling into somewhere similar. I think one of the things I mentioned in the slide was just information is anti-rival. Like the more people that know something, the more value an object has as an artifact. So individuals using Wikipedia, I mean, this is like everybody knows Wikipedia at this point. Obviously, there's some content that's not great in there, but a lot of it is, you know, relatively dependable to the best of my knowledge. And then yeah, the Farcaster question. This is another example of like how you can avoid lock-in for users or people producing content, right? The data is meant to be openly accessible, and you can design any client you want to interact with it. Whether that would be like anti-rival or just low rivalry, I don't know exactly. But it's probably closer to anti-rival. It's just like this digital object that's really available for anybody to interoperate with.
And final question from Jenna. Views on soft versus hard power in the Ethereum governance ecosystem.
If this is like an established academic term, I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know exactly what they're asking. Soft versus hard power. This is sort of like the things, the capabilities that the community has to control itself, and whether they're, I don't know, soft versus hard.
Yeah, it's a term most commonly used in military and geopolitics. So hard power is aircraft carriers. Yeah. Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
I can maybe take that really quickly. I gave a whole talk on this. My sense is that there is, maybe the best way to think about this is like formally versus informally defined power. So I think Ethereum has like a lot of formal sets of like power structures. Like for example, you know, Awkward Devs, which I chair, is like the main forum where decisions get made, and it has sort of hard power and like it decides what goes into the forks. But then as you go like towards like the outer edges of the ecosystem, there's like this more diffuse power, but that ends up being more powerful. Like the ultimate version of that's just the social consensus around what is Ethereum. Like if there's two competing forks of Ethereum, and we've had this in the past, you know, Ethereum Classic, which one gets called Ethereum, which one do people recognize, you know, has value and all of that. That soft power is like distributed across the entire community in a bunch of ways. So I think this is one thing like I really enjoy about Ethereum is you have like this kind of cluster of like more formalized power structures that in the happy case are able to be somewhat efficient at like stewarding the thing. But there is this pretty like significant check by the like soft powers in the ecosystem. And oftentimes people like will complain that like the soft power may not exist or whatnot, but I think this is just a reflection of like the hard power structures having the implicit buy-in, and every time that the hard power structures try to do something that's like opposed to the soft power structures, there is pretty significant pushback. I think that's like a healthy balance. It doesn't map exactly to like the military analogy, but I'd say this is how I think of like the distribution of like governance power in the ecosystem.
Good summary. Any other questions I missed?
Seems like that was it.
Yeah, and there's the forum if people have questions afterwards. And there's a couple comments I saw as well from the talk. But yeah, we can wrap up here.
Awesome. Thanks again for giving me the space to present and the impetus to look back on this thing that I haven't looked at in like 2 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
No, thanks for coming on. This was great. Cool.
All right.
Okay. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye, everyone.